What a great honor it is for me to be in Avichai. This is not an easy time. It's a difficult time for Am Yisrael. Zman Atzuv. It's a sad time. Zman Avilut. It's a time of mourning. And so this is a very, very difficult time. And yet it's a time of tikva, of hope, of emunah, of faith, bitachon, of Achdut Yisrael, of the coming together of our people. My minhag is to begin a humble shiur with nigun. And going back a few years during COVID, I wrote a tefillah with the help of my dear, dear, dear friend, Professor Avigdor Shinan, who is a scholar here at Avichai. And the words are, Yedidi Ahuvi Machmad Nafshi, Ana Azor Li Lehodot Licha, Al Kol Habrachot Shehe'enakta Li, Velo Latet et Libi, Al Brachot Shechaserot Li. Yedidi Ahuvi Machmad Nafshi, Ana Azor Li Likabel Be'ahava, Et Hayom She'omed Lifanai, Yom Kadosh Virav Erech. My beloved love, speaking to God, precious one, uppercase one of my soul, please help me thank you for all the blessings you've bestowed upon me, and not allow my heart to be weighed down by blessings I lack. My beloved love, precious one of my soul, please help me embrace with love the day before me, a holy day, overflowing with value and meaning. And a chaver, a friend who has touched my soul in such a deep and profound way. But Adir Chai is a Rebbe. He's a Rebbe. And he surprised me, and he took these words and he put it to a different nigun. And let's listen closely as we can close our eyes and listen to this tefillah, Adir Chai's tefillah, which I recommend everyone consider saying every morning.
Yedidi Ahuvi Machmad Nafshi, Yedidi Ahuvi Machmad Nafshi, Ana Azor Li Lehodot Lecha, Ana Azor Li Lehodot Lecha,
10:7, Shabbat Simchat Torah, was a day of joy, happiness, as we completed the Torah and we started the Torah again, reading from the first words of Bereshit, when we're told, V'choshech al pnei tehom, there was darkness on the face of the deep. And there is darkness, and then there is the darkness of darkness. There is the night, and then there is the midnight. That morning, which was a midnight, when our sisters and brothers were slaughtered by savage barbarians who slaughtered without any humanity, beheading children, raping women. And soon after, a blood libel of the sorts that we in our history have never ever seen. These days, we're not just studying history, we're living history. And that's why it is such a zechut to be here together with my wife Toby, our children who live in Efrat, a son who has been in Tel Aviv with his family. We're not studying history, we're living history. And I dedicate this to the chayalim who are ptsuim, to those who are wounded. I want to dedicate this to all the families of the chatufim, to Hirsch Polin, whose mother Rachel and father John are speaking out with such dignity, raising a voice of moral conscience, of Jewish conscience, speaking truth to power to the entire world. In Tel Aviv, this past Shabbat, we hear the siren and we run into a mamad, into the stairwell, and there was a beautiful young girl, 12 years old, just bat mitzvah Shira, beautiful young girl. And she looks up and she says to her Ima, Rabbi Anat, I'm frightened, Ima. I'm afraid. And as we move forward in talking about coping in this time of war, I want to talk about fear, overcoming fear. Is there anything wrong with being afraid? Anything wrong with pachad, with yirah? Does being fearful reflect a lack of belief? For those who believe in God, is it a lack of belief in God? For those who believe in the strength of Tzahal, a lack of confidence in Tzahal. For those who believe in a combination, as I do, is fear an indication of something negative? Indeed, in last week's Parsha, God says to Avram, after he had been victorious in battle, Al tira Avram, don't be afraid. If God says to Avraham, don't be afraid, doesn't that mean that he was afraid? How could it be that a patriarchal figure who has such trust and belief, our father who introduced monotheism and the monoistic order, how could it believe that he seems to be afraid? And even more, I'd like to focus on our third patriarch, on Yaakov. And even as I focus on the patriarchs, it's similarly true about our matriarchs, but these examples happen to be patriarchal examples. As Yaakov flees home at the behest of his mother Rivka, concerned about his brother Esav, from whom he took the blessings, he dreams. And he dreams, V'nei sulam mutzav arza, v'rosho magia hashamayma. He dreams of the ladder and malachim ascending and descending. Maybe reverberating with Jewish history, that there will be moments when we will go up and moments when we will come down. But God hovers over the entire scene. And God says to Yaakov, Hinei anochi imach, a straight out declarative promise. Behold, I will be with you. V'hashivoticha, and I will return you el ha'adama hazot. It's a promise. God says, you will come back. I will see to it that you will come back. And decades later, when Yaakov is returning, he's about ready to confront Esav, with whom his relationship had been broken. He had not seen for 22 years. The pasuk says, Vayira Yaakov ma'od vayetzelo. Yaakov was afraid and he was distressed. How could it be? Yaakov, God had promised you, I'll be with you. I'll return you el adama hazot. And you're afraid? Doesn't that fear reflect lack of belief? And so here's what I'd like to put forth about fear in explanation of this biblical narrative and a commentary, I believe, on life itself. Fear is an emotion. It's a feeling. And feelings are feelings are feelings. In a wonderful program called Marriage Encounter, there was this axiom: feelings are neither right nor wrong, they just are. The test of love is I'm able to express to my beloved my deepest feelings without being fearful that my feelings, what I'm feeling, is going to be judged, is going to be critiqued. I love you so much, I can tell you what I'm thinking deep in my heart. Feelings are feelings are feelings. Feelings are neither right nor wrong, they just are. As a matter of fact, there's even a difference of opinion whether belief in God is a commandment. After all, belief is a feeling. It's an emotion. Can anyone command that another believe? And while Rambam, Maimonides of the 12th century, whose magnum opus is, of course, read and studied and restudied, he writes in his Sefer HaMitzvot that belief in God is a first commandment. He's the arch rationalist. For him, cognitively, it's so clear God is God. But for others, like the great Rashi, like Rav Yehuda Halevi, belief in God is not a mitzvah. You can't command a feeling, can't command an emotion. That's the first step in our analysis of fear. The second step is that while we cannot control what we feel, we can control the way we act. I want to say that again. While we cannot control what we fear, we can control the way we act. I can't control what's happening within my heart and soul, but if someone commands to me, lift up your hands, I can lift up my hands. That's an action. And I can act contrary to my feeling. Feelings cannot be controlled, but actions can be controlled. Therefore, as it relates to Yaakov, was there anything wrong with a Yaakov who was coming back after 22 years, notwithstanding God's promise, V'hinei anochi imach, I'll be with you, I'll return you? Was there anything wrong with his being afraid? No. That's his emotion. That's his feeling. The question is, once he was afraid, how would he respond emotionally to that fear? Could he, notwithstanding the fear, move forward and confront Esav? I remember many years back, General Ariel Sharon was a guest at our Beit, at our synagogue in Riverdale. We call the synagogue the Beit, and a Beit is a family. I don't like the concept of congregation as much as we're all families. Am Yisrael is not just the nation of Israel. It's the family. It's the family of Israel. And I had the great honor to introduce him in front of a packed house, many, many hundreds of people. And I rise up and I say, Ariel Sharon, the fearless general who threw the pontoon bridges over the Suez Canal in the Yom Kippur War. And Sharon gets up and he looks at me in front of my congregation, whom I'm trying to impress, and he looks at me and he says, Kavod Harav. And I learned that night, when someone introduces you as Kavod Harav, duck, you're in trouble. He said to me, Kavod Harav, do you think when I was at the Suez Canal, I wasn't afraid? Of course I was afraid. It's not human not to be afraid at that moment. But the power, as I said when I responded to Sharon after his speech, is, yes, you are afraid, but your courage was you responded with action. Nothing wrong with being afraid. The test is, do we respond with fear, with action? As a matter of fact, I'd like to argue that the true hero is the one who acts contrary to one's emotion. That is to say, if I'm not afraid of going to war, that's one level of a chayal. But if I have the natural fears and nonetheless I go out there and I'm ready to give it all, that's the hero. Who is the person who is charitable? Not the one for whom money doesn't mean anything, but if money within my heart and soul means something, and naturally it's hard for me to give it away, and I nonetheless give it away, if I'm acting contrary to my emotions, that's the true charitable person. Let's take this in the writings of the Abrar Benel. And you could see this here on this text, on this source sheet, it's number 1. He writes on Vayira Yaakov Ma'od Vayetzer Lo. I'll read it in Hebrew and then in English. Pachad Yaakov v'yirato mi'esav lo haya mechushat emunato uvitchono ki b'emet libo batuach b'Hashem aval haya pachdo kederech hagibor ha'amiti שבהיכנסו למלחמה יפחד, ועל כל זה יוצא. And Jacob feared and was distressed. Jacob's dread and fear of Esau was not because he lacked faith and trust in the Lord. In truth, he fully trusted God, but his dread was like the way of the true hero, who when entering war is frightened, but nonetheless goes out. Now this is an abbreviated, abridged rendition of the Abarbanel, but this is his argument. Yes, one can be afraid. It's natural. No one should be criticized for being afraid. It's human. It's human in Israel to have fear these days. The question, though, is can we, notwithstanding the fear, act? And that's the third step. The first step is fear is an emotion. The second step is, notwithstanding that emotion that we can't control, we can act contrary to the emotion. And the third step is, once we act, the fear is dissipated. Once one acts and is involved in trying to help, in visiting chayalim, in packaging food, in making arrangements on some level that people on miluim, that their families are taken care of, once we're acting in the noble deeds that we're seeing throughout this country, it's unbelievable to see how everyone is trying to do their share. Once we're acting, the fear, I believe, is diminished. It dissipates. It's softened. And so I write in a recent commentary on the Torah called Torat Ahava. Let's take a look at number 4, which is a summary of the Abarbanel. And this is what the Abarbanel writes. It's actually a little further on. It begins with the words, Isaac Abarbanel. I'm so grateful to Chagai, to Ido, to all of the wonderful people at Avichai, and I think I forgot some names, so please excuse me, who are helping out there. What a magnificent staff, and to Tamar, thank you so, so much. Let's see what Abarbanel says. Isaac Abarbanel, who lived through the Spanish Inquisition, so he knew what fear was, suggests that fear is a sign of neither cowardice nor weakness. It is part of the human dimension, an emotion we cannot control. It just is. A person who is afraid should not be judged harshly, for who amongst us has not been afraid? The real question is what we do when we're afraid. Do we become immobilized, unable to go forward? Or do we gather strength in an attempt to meet the challenges that lie ahead? Here's the key sentences. Emotions may be involuntary, but actions can be controlled. Emotions may be involuntary, but actions can be controlled. Thus, Jacob's fear is understandable. It's part of the human condition. Jacob's greatness was his preparedness to act contrary to his natural feelings, to come back to Canaan, to confront Esau, even though he was fearful, to come back to Canaan, even though it meant confronting Esau. Again, to summarize, nothing wrong with being afraid. All of our avot and imahot, the greatest of people, had fear. It's an emotion. We can't control our emotions, but the real test, can we act notwithstanding the fear? And the real hero who acts contrary to the feelings, and that dissipates the fear. Or, on the parallel line, I may not believe in God, but the Yerushalmi says, there's a magnificent Yerushalmi where God says, if you have a choice of believing in me or doing a mitzvah, doing a commandment, do the mitzvah. From the doing, you'll come to a believing. Judaism, Yahadut, is basically a behavioral theology. At the Torah, when we were receiving the Torah, we didn't say, Nishma v'naseh, we'll listen and we'll do. No, we'll do, and from the doing comes the Nishma, comes the Shema Yisrael. That's what that Jerusalem Talmud passage means. If you have a choice of believing in me, God says, or doing and acting a mitzvah, do the mitzvah. From the mitzvah, you're going to come to believe. And so, friends, dear friends, wherever you are, this is the first half of what I wanted to share with you. The challenge to act contrary to a feeling, dissipating the fear if such is the feeling. The second half, it's not so easy to act contrary to the feeling. Not so easy. Let's think for a moment about 10:7. We've all heard so many stories. Stories of chayalim and chayalot. When they heard about what was happening down south, they grab their gun and they jump into their cars and they're running south. They're driving south quickly. And there they are, most of them not even armed properly. They're not in proper gear. And they throw themselves into the battle. Now, yes, they were afraid. Many of them may have been fearful. But I want to understand more deeply, what precipitated the action? How does a chayal do that? How does a chayelet do that? What is that? And so here I'd like to talk about hatred and a response to hatred to fill in the full picture. Hate. Hate is a powerful, powerful emotion which has ridden this world, plummeted this world throughout the centuries and to this day. Let's think about, what can I tell you? The subhuman Hamas fighters. It's subhuman to do what they did. What hatred! How is it possible that they did what they did? And the rabbis, in their own way, talk about hatred. And they say, Sin'ah mekalkelet hashura, that when you hate, you do things that defy the rule. Let's take it in this midrash. This is a midrash rabbah. Says the midrash, Sin'ah mekalkelet hashura. Hatred defies the rule. Shenema, as it says, and this is from Bamidbar Chaf Bet, Numbers 22, Vayakam Bilam baboker. Bilam, who is the heathen prophet who attempts to curse the Jewish people, he rises, Vayachavosh et atono, and he saddles his donkey. Asks the Midrash, Velo hayulo kamavadim? He didn't have any servants who could do that for him. He was one of the most influential people in the world. He must have had so many different stewards and servants and people working for him. He's saddling his own donkey? Why didn't he ask some kind of assistant to saddle his donkey? Remember years back when Bill Clinton was president, whatever. So he wanted to drive his car. He loved cars, apparently. But the FBI or the CIA or the Secret Service, presidents don't drive cars. You don't drive a car. You don't open a door for 4 years or 8 years for however long you serve. You just don't do that. Bilam doesn't do this. This is the rabbis at their best. They take what seemed to be just something so simple, so small, and they try to derive a big lesson from it. Say the rabbis, but why did he saddle his own donkey? because he wanted to curse the Jewish people with such passion, with such enthusiasm. He wanted to move with alacrity. He saddles his own donkey. Shasina mikalkelet hashura. That's the hatred. Years back, many decades back, I was blessed with knowing a wonderful colleague at Stern College, Yeshiva University. Her name was Lucy Davidowitz, and she wrote on the Shoah, and her argument was that it wasn't that the Third Reich, Oto Aish, that its goal was to conquer the world and the subtext was to murder Jews. She argues the reverse. He saw the Jews as the enemy, and that was his primary goal. And the secondary text was that if, in the process of murdering Jews, it would mean that he would have to control the world, so be it. His hatred was so great. And one of the proofs she offers, as I remember, is towards the end of the war, 44, which was a very difficult year. Many Jews were murdered and exterminated. And in 45, then the war was winding down, and Germany, the Third Reich, already knew that it was all lost. And the Allies were coming from the east, and the Russians were coming from the west. So you would think at that point, the Third Reich would use every soldier available, every gun available, every tank available to push back against their enemies, against the United States and the Soviet Union. That's not what happens, Professor Davidowitz argues. They use a tremendous amount of soldiers, of manpower, to continue the extermination, to continue killing, murdering, going against everything that's logical. That's what they were doing. I remember being in Bergen-Belsen. We were actually protesting against Reagan, if you remember. He went to Bitburg 40 years ago, and then to assuage the Jewish community, he said, well, I'll go to Bergen-Belsen. But he drew a moral equivalency between the SS Waffen and the Jews murdered in Bergen-Belsen. So a few activists went to Bergen-Belsen, and we said, Mr. President, if you're going to Bitburg, you're not welcome to Bergen-Belsen. That's the way activists think. And when we were in Bergen-Belsen, we saw these graves. Here lie 10,000. Here lie 40,000. And then they have the dates. The dates were in 1945. In 45, tens of thousands of Jews were dying, and they weren't only dying from sickness. They were killed. They were killed. How is this so? That was the hatred of the Third Reich. And when we think about what happened, what happened was not only attack against Israel, against the Moledet. The attack of Hamas was an attack against every Jew. Every Jew, I believe, has to feel, I was slaughtered. I was raped. I was decapitated. I was burnt alive. Because if they could have, they would have murdered every Jew with that kind of hatred. How do you do that? In the end, they're not animals, they're human beings, even though they acted like animals. What is it? Hatred defies the rule. But then the rabbis say that there is another passion, there is another emotion, and that is the emotion of love. And just as hatred defies the rule, love defies the rule as well. When one loves, we do things that don't seem to be the normal thing to do. That's the beauty of love. That's the beauty of the passion of love. And the rabbis say it in their own way. Let's look at the Midrash again. That Midrash continues. Not only does hatred defy the rule, ve'ahava mekalkelet et hashura, but love defies the rule. Tichtiv, it says, this is classic midrash, Vayashkem Avraham baboker. Abraham rose in the morning. And then it says, Vayachavosh et chamoro. We don't have it there on the board. And he saddled his donkey. Velo hayalo kama avadim. Abraham, after God commands him to take Isaac to Moriah, with passion, his love of God, to do God's will was such, and of course it raises the whole issue of the Akedah, and I'll just parenthetically say, the message of the Akedah is that the ultimate sanctification is not dying for God, but living for God. That's the God who intervenes at the last moment and says, Abraham, don't sacrifice your son, but that's for another time, maybe another time that I could interact with you. But looking at it just, if we can just for a moment, look at it very, very narrowly. God tells Avram to do something, and he does something which for the Medrash is contrary to the norm. Avram was one of the most famous people in the world at that time. He had great wealth. He was a great philosopher, theologian. He introduces the monoistic order. He could have told one of his servants, one of his people, Eliezer, saddle the donkey for me. He does it himself. That's the way the Medrash speaks. Medrash always speaks by looking at something narrow and trying to find something, a big message from it. It says, Vayachavosh et chamoro, why? Ahava mekalkelet hashura. Love defies the rule. Think about it. Let's think for a moment about our love of someone who's closest to us. Isn't it the case that when we love, we do things we never, ever thought we could do? Ordinary people, when they love, really love deeply, are inspired to do things that are extraordinary. Such is the way of love. And then the Medrash continues, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, and the Rashbi knew something about what it means to hate and to love, living when he did in the Roman period. Tavo chavasha v'tamod al chavasha. Let the saddling of love, that's the way the Medrash speaks, the Abraham saddling of his animal, let it overpower the saddling of Bilam of hate. Why are we here today? We're here today after millennia and millennia of horrors. We're here today because as powerful as the passion to hate may be, the passion to love with all my heart and soul is greater. We've seen it. I'm thinking back to 9/11. And it just so happens that I was there on that day. And when you walked into that space, into ground zero, on the one hand, it looked like a place of desecration. What is it? What is it in the heart of human beings to take two planes into the Twin Towers and for 3,000 people to be murdered? That was a place of sinah mekalkelet hashura. But we all know the story of police officers and firefighters who went into those buildings. Were they not concerned for their lives? But as we said before, of course they were concerned, and nothing wrong with many of them having fear. But notwithstanding, they acted contrary. And where did they find the wherewithal to act? And this is my point in our second half of this shiur. It was because they loved. They loved America. Instinctively, they had a love for the people who were being attacked. And on 10/7, we saw the worst of humankind, the worst people doing what they were doing, the worst. but we saw the best. We saw our chayalim and chayalot, and we saw the toshavim, we saw those who were living in these kibbutzim, doing everything they can to save life, to protect themselves, to protect Israel. How did they do so? It's because these chayalim and chayalot, they were passionately in love with Am Yisrael. That's why they did what they did. Passionately in love. And the passion of love will in the end be victorious over the passion of hatred. Let's look at it again from Torat Ahava. Let's see it in summary. Quoting the Midrash Tanchuma, Rashi writes, from here, this is now from the Bilam story, we learn that hatred defies the rule. Sinah mekalkelet hashura. For he, Bilam, was so full of hate, he saddled his donkey by himself. In other words, the emotion of hate can cause one to do things that would otherwise be out of the purview of one's normal behavior. The Midrash points out as well that love, not merely hatred, can have this effect. Note that when God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, the Torah states, using the same verb describing Bilam's actions generations later, that Abraham saddled his donkey. Vayachavosh et chamoro. Vayachavosh et atono, Bilam, vayachavosh et chamoro, Avraham. Here too, Rashi wonders whether it is possible that Abraham would perform this menial task rather than ask one of his attendants to do so. It is possible, says Rashi, as love defies the rule. Ava mekalkelet hashura. Abraham, our father, was so in love with God, so committed to following God's command, that he did what he otherwise would not do. The Medrash makes a final point. The hatred of the wicked is counterbalanced by the love of the righteous. In the words of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, let the saddling done by Abraham counteract the saddling done by Bilam. There you have this modest approach to perhaps a theology of coping with this horrific war. Our first step is to understand that although there may be fear, we have the power to act against our emotions of fear. We have the power to make sure that fear will not immobilize us, to act contrary to that fear. And in that action, the fear is dissipated. And our second step was to argue that it is the love of Am Yisrael that inspires the action. We're actually moving in opposite direction. The first piece said that it's the action that is the point of departure. The action will dissipate the fear. Our second point is that it's the deep love that causes one to jump into the fire, to do what our chayalim and chayalot did, to just jump into the fire. Love of Am Yisrael inspires doing for Am Yisrael. The doing counteracts the fear, and the love inspires the doing. Yes, this is a difficult time, but we're seeing the love. Here I am sitting in Yerushalayim and reading from this beautiful work that Geya Aronoff Bernstein wrote. It's a psalm song. It's a psalm on each chapter of Tehillim, and it was translated by Professor Avigdor Shinan. Just read to you a piece of loving Jerusalem. Ohavei Yerushalayim, biroga bishalva, bikshu shalom, ben chomot armonoteha, Matzu tzivot chaverim bishareha. Lovers of Jerusalem, tranquility, serenity, seek peace within her palace walls. Find army of friends at her gates. I speak for the sake of brothers and foes. I speak for the sake of man's trying to live at home with God, for the good of his house, for the good of us all. Yes, what we've experienced has happened in the past. Throughout the millennia, there have been pogroms. This was a pogrom. We got a sense, as has been said by others, of what would happen if, God forbid, we don't have a state, if we don't have an army. For reasons no one understands, there were many mistakes made then, but I think the approach now, not to deal with that, but to deal with the war and to be victorious, is the priority. But what we saw then, what has happened throughout the millennia, the pogroms of the slaughters and of the brutal murders. But there's one difference. Achshav yesh lanu medinat Israel. Now we have a state of Israel. And so, friends, join me in the Hoda'ah. Hoda'ah, thanksgiving to God, is also a form of prayer. Join me in saying, Ashrei ha'am, sheyesh lo medina kimdinat Yisrael. Blessed be the nation that has as its state the state of Israel. Ashrei ha'am sheyesh lo tzava, tzava chazak, tzava musari, tzava she'inatzeach, kitzva hagana l'Yisrael. Blessed be the country that has as its army the Israeli Defense Forces, strong and moral, that will be victorious. Every time I see chayalim on bases or in the streets, I ask you, when you see them, stop. 2 words, say thank you. My mantra is, Ani rav me'atzot habrit, bati lizdahot, lagid lachem, ava, ava, ava lachem, shetenatzchu v'tashuvu habayta b'shalom. Because you, the soldiers of Israel, are not only defending the state of Israel, you're not only defending the Moledet, you're defending Jews throughout the world. And not only that, the Americans have to understand, the West has to understand, that Israel today is in the forefront of saving the Western civilized democratic world. One of the highest priorities on the Western agenda is to fight terrorism. And who's out front declaring, as is often declared in Tzahal, Acharai, after me? It's Medinat Yisrael. Ashrei ha'am sheyesh lo tzava, kitzva hagana l'Yisrael. Let each of our soldiers go out, come back in peace. And so on that day, we were reading from Breshit, V'choshech al pnei tahom. But then the Torah says, Vayome Elokim yehi or. And God says, let there be light. Vayehi or. And there was light. That's the Hasidic teaching. Ktsat mehaor doche harbe min hachoshech. A little bit of light can push away the darkness. Yes, that wasn't just the night, it was the midnight. But once we arrive at midnight, we turn the corner and we're moving closer to the dawn of day, to the Ayelet HaShacha, to the Neitz HaChama. And or, light, is not only the dawn, not only the sun, but it's each of you, each of us. We've all been called up to serve. Some are serving in Madei Tzava, in the green Tzahal uniforms, and others are serving in their own uniforms. And everyone can make that contribution, as I know each and every one of you is making that contribution. And you never know. You never know whether this small, small giving can make the whole difference. And so we close as we started, with the bracha that Medinat Yisrael remain strong, that our leaders be strong, remain humble but strong, and make the right decisions, that our chayalim and chayalot be strong and come home safely. Yes, to the Choshech we want to say, Vayome Elokim Yehi Or. And God wants us to partner with Him and to declare, there will be light. There will be light from Metula to Eilat. In the Merkaz, the Moshavim, in the Kibbutzim, in the cities. This was a dark day, but God willing, it's going to be one of our greatest days. And Bezrat Hashem, we will overcome. Yehi Or, Yehi Or, Yehi Or.